All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just getting going live here. So for the second panel of tonight, we're very happy to have a bunch of composers, scholars who've been working with Gamelan, with other ethnomusicology groups, or they are ethnomusicologists, sorry. But this panel, we'll be talking a little bit about ways in which cultural exchange happens and discourses around that. Before I cede the floor to Menon, who will be hosting this meeting, I want to acknowledge that that the Canadian Music Center is located on is based in Toronto, and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we thank the Indigenous people who share this land with us and allow us to be here as uninvited guests. The Canadian Music Center was founded in 1959, and in acknowledging that history, that we were established in the context of violent state policies targeting Indigenous communities, including the potlatch ban, the 60s scoop, and residential schools. And these policies are not part of some dark chapter that has ended and is in the past, as injustice against and violence against Indigenous peoples are ongoing. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous peoples, and the funding of Indigenous-led education curriculum, and many more well-documented forms of systemic violence. To acknowledge the land is to acknowledge the ongoing history of genocidal policies that dispossess Indigenous peoples in order to facilitate the exploitation of land by and for the enrichment of settlers. Acknowledging the land is to acknowledge that the CMC and many legacy arts organizations within Canada have been part of racist policies that devalue and seek to erase Indigenous cultural expression. As part of our accountability, we have been working with our Accountability for Change Council and the Indigenous Advisory Councils on ways to redress this injustice connected especially to our existing collection of works, and also to guide our thinking about language, services, and programming now and in the future. And a very appropriate tie-in to the conversation we'll be having today. So with that, I'll cede the floor to Menon, who will introduce himself and the panelists.
Great, thanks, Joseph. So I'm Menon Dworka, as Joseph said. I'm in Toronto and currently working with the Arts Consulting Group when we do a number of different services across the continent, both in Canada and the US. But I think probably why the organizers of this symposium asked me to join is that, I was trained as a musician, but my cultural background, I am ethnically South Asian, but born in Latin America, in Guyana. I was raised from the ages of 6 months to 25 in Toronto. Then I went to New York for about 20 years and have come back after my mother passed away almost a decade ago to take care of my father, because that's what we Hindus do. So this idea of authentic cultural expression and geography and religion and identity are very complex in my own life, and I'm always curious about these questions. So, and I think this is going to come up quite heavily today in our conversation. I'd really like to hear what our panelists say. So why don't I just get to jump to have our panel introduce themselves. Why don't I start with Leslie Tilley first?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So thanks, terima kasih, to the organizers for putting together this, what so far I think has been a really stimulating symposium. That first panel was incredibly rich. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we've been asked to talk for just a few minutes about our work and sort of how it relates to these questions, and I'll be pretty brief so we can get into the juicy stuff. So I am an ethnomusicologist and a music analyst. I currently work at MIT, and being an ethnomusicologist and a music analyst means, on the one hand, as an ethnomusicologist, I like to talk to and learn from lots of people. And then as an analyst, I'm interested in understanding what's happening in the music that they play. I've been playing and studying Balinese gamelan, mostly Gongkabyara and Smarandana, since 2000, which is suddenly feels like a long time. And how that's taught outside of Indonesia is as a pretty fixed practice usually. But of course, in Bali, it's full of improvisation and creativity and change over time. So that sort of, when I realized that that was true, that led to a particular interest for me in musical transformation. So how musicians take things that might seem like fixed things, but in fact aren't, and do things with them. So like a jazz tune and chord changes can become many, many different versions of that thing. So my first book I published a couple of years ago was Chicago. I'll just share a couple links in the chat and you can feel free to do what you like with them. This book is about musical transformation. It's mostly about improvisation and especially collective improvisation. And it's got two big case studies from music in Bali, this extraordinary drumming tradition called Kenang Arda, which is a paired drumming practice where the musicians interlock very tightly, as many Balinese practices do, but also improvise at the same time. And my question was, well, how the heck are they doing that? And then the other practice that I look at is Rayong Norot, which is a similar interlocking four-person practice that is also improvised. And again, the how the heck do they do that question comes up. And I use those case studies to think about what does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to have that within a constraint, and how do those become musical practices, basically. But as I'm going along doing this work, being a white Canadian person writing about, and in some weird way, suddenly being assumed to be an expert in Balinese music became increasingly uncomfortable for me, increasingly strange, and it became increasingly important for me to think about representation, and by extension, to think about pedagogy and how do we represent the cultures that we happen to be writing about, especially if they aren't ours. And so some of my more recent work is moving in that direction, and I'll just tell you about three brief things and then pass it off to the next person. So the first was that a couple of years ago, I was asked to write a chapter for the Cambridge Companion to Rhythm. And I was specifically asked to write, and I'll just pop that in the chat too, I was specifically asked to write about Colin McPhee and those other sort of mid-20th century composers who were influenced by gamelan. And I took that as an opportunity to explore his works and those of Britten and Steve Reich, but also I used it as a space to think about the creative mishearings that those composers had, the truly fundamental features of Balinese gamelan that they overlooked in the process of doing their own composing, and about the ethics of those exchanges, and also what that might suggest about future exchanges. And I think probably we got some really wonderful answers to that in the previous panel, and hopefully some more to come. The second thing, I've got an article coming out hopefully later this year in the journal for the American Gamelan Institute, Balungan, which if you were at the last panel, Jody Diamond introduced to us. Here's the website in case you don't know it. And this is an article that looks at the ways that we teach gamelan outside of Indonesia. What are the ethics? What are the complications of doing that kind of work? How might we thoughtfully alter our pedagogies and also the pedagogies of our teachers to help players who are not enculturated, players from outside Indonesia, to get inside the music in a fuller way? What does that mean about representation? What does that mean about exchange? And then the last thing I'll say is that earlier this year, I was a guest editor for a music theory pedagogy journal called Engaging Students, and they had a special issue called Beyond Western Musicalities. And the function of that, or the goal of that, was to explore different ways that we could diversify and maybe even move toward decolonizing the music theory classroom. And so for this volume, I co-wrote a big introductory article with two fantastic music theorists, Anna Yuang and Chris Stover. And we sort of talked about what are the options and the opportunities, but also what are the challenges and the stumbling blocks about efforts to diversify, efforts to decolonize the way we teach. What does it tell us about dominant epistemologies? How can we work within and beyond those? Yeah, so I think that's all I'll say. All of those things I think are going to dovetail really interestingly into what we're talking about tonight. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to hear from you all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leslie. Next, why don't we go to, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Iwan Gonawan. Are you out there?
Yeah, man. I'm here.
Great. Please tell us about yourself.
I'm Iwan Gunawan. I'm from Bandung, West Java, Indonesia. I'm a composer, also educator. And what else I have to introduce? Okay, for me, it's enough. Just it to introduce me. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
We'll come back then and we'll ask you some extra questions. So, how about Curtis? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I don't know who else is out there except for the people I see on my screen. But I assume there's other people. Yeah, my name is Curtis Andrews. I'm speaking to you all from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on the unceded ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish people. Who am I? Is a big question. I'm a musician, a composer, an academic, I suppose. I have a PhD also in ethnomusicology, but I'm not very active in that realm as of late, it seems. But yeah, I've worked a lot over the past 20, I don't know, 25 years, 24 years, I suppose, in music that is not my own, so to speak. It's not music I was born with or raised within, the culture that produces that music. And primarily I work in two realms, which is the music of West Africa, specifically a small subculture, not a subculture, it's a major culture, within the southeastern part of Ghana, Togo and Benin. There's an ethnic group called Ewe. So the Ewe people have been working a lot with them, learning a lot from them. And concurrently to that, I've been studying the music of South India for around the same length of time. Those are two very different experiences, two different, well, in every way, almost, those are two very different realms. So it's kind of like I've got this, I won't say bipolar experience, because there's more than just those two things that go on, but those have been a very much influential part of my life, along with the music that one hears in North America growing up, and jazz and improvised music I explore as well. I did a PhD in ethnomusicology at UBC after Leslie she had also gone there. After she had went away, I entered the fray, and I focused on religious music, actually, spiritual traditions, and the musical nexus amongst the Ewe, specifically in one shrine, and dealing with ideas of, I guess, indigenous epistemologies in that context was a major thing vis-a-vis external influences, in that context, specifically European colonization and the onslaught of Christianity and the aftermath of that. As a composer, I work a lot with, not in the classical quote unquote realm. It's more in the, I won't even call it the jazz realm, because I don't consider myself a jazz musician as such, but whatever exists in between those two things, that's where I compose and write music for. Usually for my own ensemble, but other ensembles at times request me to compose. And a lot of my compositions reflect a lot of the experiences I've had musically with the music of West Africa and the music of South India. So I'm interested to answer and reflect on some of these questions. They're very pertinent to me, and I've thought about them a lot, versus as reflects my own, positionality and my background. I'm not South Asian. I'm not West African. There's no connection to me historically to any of those places genetically, as far as I know. But here I am, involved and intertwined with those worlds. And let's see where it goes.
Great, thank you for that, Curtis. And now, Juro Kim Felix.
All right, so I am Juro Kim Feliz. a Filipino composer based here in Toronto, and I studied composition back in the University of the Philippines. And that's actually when my first encounter with gamelan, with the Javanese gamelan was. I've also connected with many colleagues in Southeast Asia, specifically also in Indonesia as well. So that's where my first connections with the Indonesian network would be. I've even met Iwan Gunawan, actually, was also part of this panel in Bandung, and that was in 2011 for a certain competition that's pretty much like part of this growing Southeast Asian contemporary music scene at that time. And I moved to Canada in 2013, late 2013, I think. Yeah, I did my master's at McGill University. My interest in the Javanese gamelan kind of like grew to the point that I kind of placed my master's thesis. I positioned my master's thesis on trying to translate musical languages, specifically from Javanese gamelan to Western composition, with probably, I don't know, mixed results. So there are lots of problems in the kinds of things that I did way back then. And that's also probably why I'm now here in this panel, I would say.
Great, thank you so much, Jero. So maybe I'll go back to Iwan since he didn't get to speak very much earlier, but I'm wondering, since you're the only person who's actually located in the traditions that we're talking about, do you have an idea about what the word authenticity means about those traditions? Is there such a thing as an authentic tradition in your mind?
Okay, this is question for me. Yes, Menon?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, to be honest, I'm confused to answer because I also have the question. Actually, what's the meaning of the authentic in the culture or in the musically? But what I believe is the authentic is just something like me as composer just to try to compose as authentically. This is just authentic, but the rest is just something uh something else to should be to share. Like I it's mean you know I'm from West Java or from Sundanese culture, but if I give question for myself, uh, what's the position in culture? So I very confused to answer. Like the question first to Juro, you are a Philippine. Why you not play kulintang, not to gamelan, or maybe Jody? So that's why I agree 100% what Jody said or what Iwayan said in several times. So to the authentically is also relate with the identity. So the identity in now, I think this is very important to see what we can collect the all experience in the world, in the culture in the world, and of course we have to choose which is interesting, and there all the experience in the culture we can collect and we can create to more authentic because sometimes for my experience I found something similarity in the differences of the world. So I'm more interesting of the similarity than the differences. So this is my answer about authenticity. Authenticity. So maybe in some case we still need and very important to concern about the authenticity or authenticity. But for me as a composer is no matter anymore. So I have background, Sundanese background. I can take out because it's already in my body, in my mind. But
Mhm.
also I am interesting to another thing. So what's the authenticity? The authenticity. So this is my mind. So that's why I always to see like see the Jody. I'm not see she is the foreign musician now, but I see then she is have same interesting. Yeah, it's no matter she is Western or she is not Indonesian. It's no matter for me. And also for Euro, you know, in Indonesia there are a lot of people, a lot of musicians. They didn't know about the gamelan. They didn't know. They just know maybe more now about the Western music. So, but this is live. So, so that's why for also in my government, like how to make some reservation of our tradition and etc. etc. For me, porno is doesn't work. So we have to share the word to our authenticity in myself, but it doesn't matter from what source culture. This is my opinion. Thank you.
No, that's great because I mean, I'll be very transparent with everybody that I'm among many of the things that I do in Toronto. I sit on a number of funding boards, and some that fund organizations like the Evergreen Club. And there has been, Ewan, I'm not sure if this term is used where you are, but the term social justice warrior. I don't know if you've heard this, but it's basically there are people who say, how dare these white men in Toronto play this gamelan music? It's not their tradition. This is colonialism. And I was curious what if you had any thoughts about that. Sounds like you wouldn't agree with that, but there are many times where I'm in a room having to defend the rights of people to play music of a tradition they don't look like or they didn't grow up in. So I'm curious how are your feelings about people playing gamelan music that don't come from that place?
Yeah. I personally, generally, of course, I'm glad there is like the some music is very close with me, and there are also exists in the other country, and especially for Evergreen Club, this is very special because you know in the world the community of Sundanese Gamelan is very little than the Japanese and the Balinese. So that's why it's very special. And uh, for me, that was very amazing. And when they play the degung, even they play traditional repertoire, of course, if I have compare with the authentic or original pieces, how the Sundanese people play is very different.
Mhm.
Maybe we can say this is not enough or there is some lack. But for me, no. I think the African club was play very uniquely. What they can play what the best play. I I cannot compare with how the people play in here, because what the way of the African club doing with the Sudanese gamelan doing that's something very great. Then in here the Indonesian or Sudanese people then play the gung, and more the interesting for me how the relation between the Sundanese culture and the contemporary culture, that's mean from Western also there's very mixed and more for myself is very inspiration. So that's
Mhm.
why I know the Evergreen Club when I'm still studying, yeah, and I was met Andrew, and Andrew didn't know who am I, so I yeah, but after that we met, and so we have some strong connection, yes, strong connection, because what I know, what Evergreen Club is built is also is something come from my culture. So that is okay, and that is amazing for me.
Great, thanks, anyone. I'm curious about anyone else's thoughts about authenticity or anything else that you want just brought up. Maybe Jiro, since he actually called on you or invoked your name during his answer, would you like to contribute your thoughts about authenticity?
All right. Well, I can pretty much echo what Mas Iwan was actually talking about in terms of it's really about the distinction between like being and doing, right? As we actually live our daily lives, so we actually be rather than we do. Doing is more of a very deliberate intent, to actually do something. Being is really just like making it all flow, and identity actually just like manifests in the ways of being. And my problems with authenticity is more about there are these concerns about demanding proof of it, which also leads to you have to come up with a certain form of representation on like how to show authenticity, right? And that already kind of falls into the domain of doing rather than being, because how do you actually show then that you're Filipino or you're Indonesian or you're Sundanese and all that, right? Despite we can rely on soundings and sound worlds and all that in terms of creative work, but that's already like it kind of begets representation, and there's politics involved in doing so. So who gets the loudest voices? Who gets the spotlight, the visibility? Again, we're playing in terms of currencies here, like the people who have social capital and whatnot in actually like putting their voices out there, they get to actually be represented. So authenticity kind of like for me like brings that up, and also the very last thing about the word itself is it also kind of brings the discourse on purism, because when we talk about being authentic, we're actually like prescribing a certain form of something, and that has to stay as is. So we're kind of like there is such a thing now as being like this is the quintessential or the archetypal versus what other people are already doing, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I have those are my problems regarding that. In terms of offering solutions instead, like for me, what I found is positionality. Positionality is key. Dylan Robinson actually have talked about this in his latest book, Hungry Listening, and especially coming from an Indigenous perspective, because Dylan himself is Indigenous as well. He's a scholar. He's pushing for this idea of positions. Like we have to know our relationship with these cultures or sound worlds or other things that we are actually trying to include in our work and all that. So positionality might be more important than like expressing authenticity at this point. That's what I actually think about it.
Great. Thank you, Jero. Leslie, I saw you nodding your head about purity during that point. Do you have any thoughts about this in general?
Yeah, thanks, Iwan and Jero. A lot of meaty stuff in there. Like the concept of authenticity is so fraught. I'm fundamentally pretty uncomfortable with it. As I think being trained as an ethnomusicologist, there's this old history of ethnomusicology of being like, we're trying to find the stuff that's other from us and save it quickly before it gets influenced by Western people. And, that was sort of a 19th century belief about what was going on in comparative musicology. And when I think about the term authenticity, especially if you're applying it to like, are you Indonesian enough if you're composing contemporary music? Is that something that is authentic? To me, that, smacks of what Putu was talking about earlier about Indonesian people being forced to cater to an outsider's vision of what an Indonesian person is supposed to be. And I never in my life have I been asked to be an authentic Canadian person, or an authentic white person, or an authentic whatever, maybe an authentic Nova Scotian, right? If we're getting regional enough, that happens. But like, so there's something about dominant and minoritized people and who has the right to define who must be authentic and who doesn't need to be authentic, because that is like, I have all these unmarked categories that I have that it's just, there is no need for me to be an authentic Canadian because nobody even sees that I'm Canadian. I'm just the person in the room. Except maybe in this room where I'm not, where I'm one of the only Canadians, or am I? Or I don't know, how many Canadians are there in this room? So yeah, I find that concept to be fundamentally uncomfortable and pretty wrong-headed in many ways. However, coming back to Juro, what you're saying around positionality, what happens when a person like me then teaches Balinese music for a living? Are there different standards, or should there be different standards? And I'm not entirely sure what the answer is to this question yet, but I think maybe it's yes. Should there be different standards for different positionalities in terms of how closely we have to think about, like, am I allowed to just do whatever I want to if I want to compose a piece of music with, can I just like play some Balinese instruments and not, and as freely as I would like to, or do I have to, because I'm an outsider, pay more attention to something traditional? Or, I mean, I think this will come to some of the later questions that we asked. So is there a need for an outsider to be more conservative in the way that they think about defining their work or their ideas? Or is that totally patronizing and colonial? And, you know, Gage Averill talks about musical transvestitism. If you're trying to do something that's too authentic, you're actually, it's a little bit gross, actually. So I find the concept really complicated. I find it not that useful when you're thinking about culture bearers, but I find it there's maybe something there when you're talking about people in historically dominant positions taking on other people's music and choosing to do what they like with it. I think that there are complex questions around that. And I would love to hear what Curtis has to say about that.
Let's go to Curtis and see what his thoughts are.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said here. The idea, or should we say the myth of purity in any cultural context, you know, that's been well recognized as a fallacy, something being pure, anything. Culture exists on a major continuum that's always evolving. So in the end, it comes down to, all these questions comes down to perception and position. We'll use that, but that's going to be the buzzword I think of today, is the positionality, or position, one's position. Because perception, no two people will view or listen or experience an object or an artifact or a sound the same way. Everyone's going to bring something to that, their own prejudices, their own previous enculturation, their own experiences. So if someone sees me, I'll use me as an example. If someone sees me playing in a West African context in Ghana, where the audience will be primarily Ghanaians, versus the same performance in Vancouver, they're all going to view that with different lenses, and maybe perhaps with different issues. Some will view it as a very pleasing thing. Some may see it as a very distressing thing. So it comes down to, you know, one's perception regarding the authenticity or lack thereof of such a performance. Again, that comes down to memory to a degree, and what one thinks of or remembers of being as something relating to the authentic version of something. This is usually related to the past. From what I've experienced, people look at authenticity and purism as something that harkens to the age before they were involved with the thing, or when they were younger and involved with the thing. So I see that with Carnatic music is a huge discourse about, you know, the golden age of Carnatic music was in the 50s, 40s to 60s. You know, what's happening today is, you know, very so different than the great masters of the past, but people are making great music today, and you'll find a spectrum of people who agree with that or don't agree with it based on their age and whatnot, among other things. So what is authentic? You know, we could be forever trying to discover what that is. There's always going to be some aspect of, let's focus it on a musical system. There's always going to be some aspect that if you dig deep enough, you may find that at one point it was not considered authentic, but over generations that became enculturated and became accepted as the authentic thing. You know, numerous examples we can all think of, so I'm sure. So is it useful to think about authenticity? I only echoed perhaps yes in the context that Leslie mentioned, where well, actually both the contexts. Whereas if you're a person from a particular musical culture playing, and you have an outsider, usually someone from outside your culture, perceiving you and judging you really about what you're doing, is what you're doing authentic enough for their idea of what that should be? But then on the other side, if it's someone like me or Leslie playing music that's not quote unquote ours, to what extent should we portray some idea of authenticity? And even then, what does that even mean? What are the boxes that had to be checked to make it seem authentic? You know, in the end, you're never going to please everybody about this. So it comes down to, I'm not going to say it comes down to intention purely, but every person that, you know, is in the position that I'm in or Leslie's in has to really think about this and what they've put in, given back to the particular, you know, musical culture or larger culture that they've benefited from. And there's a somewhat of a responsibility there, because it's inevitable. You're going to meet other people. They're going to ask you or see you expert on given, you know, musical culture. So definitely people like us will have to think about this and be aware of these issues more than someone from within. But they're still, I guess, like I said, they're not immune from it, because there's this other side where people expect such people to reflect their idea of what something should be, to be the quote unquote authentic version of it, you know. Yeah, there's no correct answer here, really.
And Curtis, maybe I'll stay with you for a second, because you did mention how things in the past that became authentic now weren't authentic back then, and how you and Leslie have a more complex relationship with authenticity. And with the fact that you play music of different other styles, I'm wondering if there's an upside for you for being inauthentic. Like, do you feel that there's a way that you can be part of this tradition and not be, and if there's actually not a terrible thing in that place?
I'd say that there's I'm privileged. I have a privilege in the fact that I'm not from the inside, so to speak. So if I break the norms or break the rules in whichever way, whether that's in a compositional form or whether it's in performance practice, I'm not going to be, for some people, I won't be seen as, you know, destroying the tradition, so to speak, right? It'll almost be expected, almost at times, that an outsider will do it, quote unquote, wrong, or, you know, do things that are not authentic. But you know, I would say there's an upside to it, or should I use the word benefit, only in being inauthentic, only in so much as it allows you to play with perceptions and people's expectations. And again, that's all dependent on the audience you're performing for or who's listening to your music, because again, everyone's going to bring something to that. You know, if I play mridangam in a contemporary improv setting, that's very different than me playing it in a global world music jam type setting, those kind of things, which, you know, I don't enjoy that much. But they both exist, same instrument, same person playing them, but in one, the improvised, contemporary improvised, immense freedom would be there to play that extended techniques, you know, arrhythmically, whatever, things that are not part of the normal performance practice. In a quote unquote world music context, one would be expected to stay within the parameters of what's the instrument or the tradition, you know, entails. So, you know, again, context determines a lot of these things. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Curtis. Leslie, maybe I can ask, since you study these traditions, you must see things that are inside, more located within a tradition, and things that are kind of spilling over. I'm curious what your thoughts are in your work about the interaction of authentic and inauthentic, and if there is, from your view, also a positive to being inauthentic in these traditions.
Yeah, so I mean that first has to lay on the fact that I believe in the concept of authenticity at all, which, as I've sort of said, I'm not sure that I do. If I did, if I believe that there was such a thing as authentic Balinese music, for instance, 100% people should be working outside it, because that is what music does, right? Music changes and it grows. And I think there are disrespectful ways to play outside of a music if it doesn't belong to me. But I think there are things that can come from creative mishearing if you then can learn from them, or hear a connection between, Iwan was talking earlier about the connection, the similarities between different traditions. And I think some of those might come from a mishearing of something. So then you find a connection that maybe someone who's really steeped in that tradition wouldn't find. And then that can create beautiful hybrids, or it can create new ways of thinking about things. As an outsider playing gamelan music, for instance, I think, again, not sure I believe in authenticity or inauthenticity, but if I did, I think there's a responsibility to just be transparent, to frame what you're doing in a way that is specific. So you're not saying this is authentically Balinese or inauthentically Balinese, but here are the elements that I learned from this teacher from this village, and here are the elements that I added in that are different. So creating an understanding that the tradition isn't static, but that you can borrow things from different practitioners in different places who do things in different ways, that there's no such thing as unauthentic way to do Balinese gamelan, because lots of Balinese people do it differently. But that there are certain practices that are predominant in lots of places. And if I want to teach a gamelan ensemble to a bunch of non-Indonesian people, I'll probably want to keep in mind those things that are predominant. But being able to say, these are the things that I will add to it, or these are the things that I will change, and here is why. I think there are benefits to that. I certainly do that pedagogically. I use techniques that are not what I would say authentic Balinese teaching techniques, because my students didn't grow up in Bali listening to gamelan music. So in order to teach them that thing, in order to teach them to hear the music the way I think my Balinese teachers hear the music, for instance, I have to do it in a different way. So I think there are benefits to inauthenticity, if you want to call it that, on a bunch of these different scales. But I still feel hesitant about the concepts themselves.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Jero, I'm curious, as your work as a composer too, do you have thoughts about how you may use Balinese music mixed in with other styles, and your thoughts on authentic versus inauthentic, or tradition that is closer to the center and maybe on the periphery? Just thoughts about that.
All right. Well, I would say the same about being like whether to actually subscribe to authenticity versus inauthenticity. But what I can say is that there is such a thing as misrepresentation. So there is definitely that concept, that idea there. And actually, what brings to mind is it's not really just happening in artistic circles, because I don't know. I don't necessarily want to bring this in the Indonesian context, but in the case of the Philippine context, we do have such a thing as inventing our myths and all that. This is probably something as a result of being colonized and all that, in that we actually lost our pre-colonial roots, and that we just have to invent ourselves. In the long run, it's just like trying to invent that. Like we have all these indigenous cultures around the Philippines, and then we are also coming up with again another archetype that this is what we can call Filipino music, and probably this can be the same in terms of the Indonesian gamelan, where everything is put into this umbrella of like Indonesian gamelan, and where in fact we actually have lots of different cultures in terms of like Sundanese village practices, or like in the court musics of Java and all that. So there is lots of other things going on that are being just like put into this certain box that is invented. And you know what? This is actually the work of the nation state. So I think we also have to like put that into consideration, like how much of the nation state is implicates itself in the production of these kinds of concepts or of these representations. And so for me, as in my work as a composer, I try to stay away from that. It's also a kind of unlearning, because if you have been brought up in a certain way, you know, like nationalism has been imbued in us, you know, especially I think Iwan could also like relate to this in a certain way, because being Southeast Asian for the most part is also just like being colonized, you know. So it's like, yeah, nationalism has been imbued in our education systems, and we are just really like pretty much like stuck in the idea that we have to promote ourselves as a nation, as, you know, as a people and all that, being also part of third world countries or developing countries. So that's also pretty much like coming in the mix there. So my work as a composer, I try to veer away from that kind of political narrative, and instead engage in cultures, or if I need to, that really just like speaks to the effect of that this is the story of this culture, this is my story, everything's happening together all at the same time, and that's where I can actually spatialize my work. So creating space to actually contain all of these happening at the same time, for me, that's what matters more.
Great, thank you for that, Jiro. Iwan, I'm going to slightly modify this question, but do you feel when, as a composer and a creator, and you do things that you know are outside of maybe the traditions you were taught, do you have any kinds of thoughts about being disloyal to those traditions, or are you thinking about that your main emphasis has to be creative and following your imagination? I'm just curious about how you wrestle as a creator with this idea of tradition and going beyond it.
Okay. So yeah, I agree 100% what Juro said. Yeah, but for my side, I just think about the how I can create to invent new thing with the source what I know, and include my tradition, include what called this is the authentic tradition. But for me to create something new also, I have to go to as outsider first to see what's happened in my culture, and then if I know and I can realize what should be do. So this is what I did. Yeah. So back to remind the discussion, the last discussion, Pak Sutrisno about the Pak Sutrisno music. That's the music of Sutrisno is not Japanese again. So this is the risk. Also, like me, if I use the gamelan and the people called this is not gamelan. So this is also the same question like what is authentic. So what is the gamelan? So this is for me is, I don't know, something between easy and complex answer about the authentic. But as your question, how I create, so I always very important to go to as outsider to see what's happened in the my culture and what's happened in the other culture and what should I do to feel. Because for me the ideas of the music, yeah, generally art music is like what's called the word heritage. word heritage. So we can share everything what we think to the other people, what matter, no matter from what, but how we can share and learn, and we can, what's the finally we can more respectful to each human. This is uh, most important for me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'm curious too, just with adapting these traditions and pulling things forward and being creative, if any of the panelists have thoughts about how do we, honor those roots or those traditions or the folks that help us get to where we are now. Obviously in the West, one of the ways that people do that is through copyright, by showing ownership and authorship. I was curious if people are adapting oral traditions and expanding on them. What are our thoughts about how do we make sure the people who came before us in these traditions are not just honored, but supported? I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts about the interaction of copyright and authorship with these kinds of oral traditions. Yes, Curtis.
I can speak, I guess, a little bit about that, or whatever I can contribute. The idea of copyright, and we're using the word copyright here instead of intellectual property.
You can substitute for your answer if you like.
Well, because when I think of copyright, when we invoke that term, I'm thinking of the process of copyrighting something and giving specific credit and registering that with some organizational structure like SOCAN or whatnot, which then would benefit the people that are registered within the thing. So speaking on that, for what I do, it's very difficult to do something like that because I generally don't use specific, what would be considered the belonging to a specific person who created something, and that's the difficulty, I guess, with not let alone oral traditions, but I guess communal traditions. Like no one person within that particular society can be said to own X, Y, Z unless they are recognized to have composed this song or this piece or this choreograph, this dance or whatever. And in my experience, especially in the West African context, that's very rare for the music that I've worked within. The way that, and within the Carnatic context, it's a little different. There's still, you can have more of a quote unquote copyright recognition for certain things. Whether it be a small composition, rhythmic composition, I'll use the word corvai or mora, but most people don't know what those are, but they can be seen as being attributed to a particular person. But for what I do, or what I try to do anyways, in terms of, if not recognizing the copyright idea, but in terms of not even composition, but at least giving, what's the word I'm looking for? Not giving space, giving opportunity, is that I try and work with as many people as possible within the circle I work within, which thankfully is becoming broader globally thanks to some technologies. But I try and involve a lot of people from the people's music, the areas that I work within and play within, create within. So that's not always possible. Recognize that depending where you live and who's around you. But especially with arts funding, if I'm lucky to get good funding, then I make that a point, is to try and bring in people that are not here to work with me in these contexts. Because I learn a lot from those people as well. But I think it's very important to try and collaborate, give a opportunity to the people that have, or the people from the cultures that have, I've benefited from so much, as one small thing you can do. But yeah, in terms of copyright, in again, my experience, it's hard unless like I know the composer of a song and I'm like arranging that song, then that would be a different situation. But if I'm using like a melodic mode that's widely used in a particular musical culture, how does one copyright that? It's kind of extreme examples. But yeah, there's a spectrum that exists within that, I suppose.
Thank you, Curtis. Any other thoughts about how we honor these traditions as we expand on them and change them, or even questions about that you may have come into before? And maybe I'm gonna maybe show my hand a little, and what I'd really like to know, and Leslie kind of touched on it earlier, is that when does this music stop becoming connected to its tradition? Like, how far can we stretch this? And maybe I'll give a nod to our hosts here and say, when I was a teenager, I remember hearing on the radio a premiere commissioned by John Cage for Evergreen, for the Evergreen Club, and a piece called, I think, Haikai for Gamelan. Of course, it sounded like gamelan music because it was on those instruments, but I don't think anyone listening it would have mistaken it for anything traditional. So I'm just curious about, if we have trouble with authentic and inauthentic, how far can we stretch this thing before it stops becoming gamelan music? Is it just any music that's played on these instruments? And what if we take away those instruments and arrange it for something else? Is it still gamelan? I'm sure you folks have thought about this, but Iwan, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. Maybe my opinion is a bit radical. Yeah, but that is the point. What I'm now studying also the contemporary gamelan, and there are two things what I very interesting. First, what I already said about the opinion about the identity. What Sadra said, and the second is like what the Sabto Raharjo said. He said that the gamelan is the spirit. So gamelan is not about physically as instrument, but in the gamelan there is some ideas, and very uniquely as gamelan. But it's not just physics. Maybe we cannot hear exactly, but there is something we can call this is from gamelan. So that's why, like what I see some research in New Zealand. I didn't remember who, but it's very important. They make some differences for the gamelan music, like music for gamelan and music from gamelan. So this is what I think. That's mean to make music gamelan, it not should be used gamelan, but the main idea, the what's I can call what is like the spirit, what Raharjo said, this is still kept by people. Like for example, I yes, like the haikai from John Cage, yeah. This is very connected with our tradition, our call authentic tradition. If we want to more research, yeah, sometimes we can found some general idea. So that's why, like what I shared the last time when we doing a project Gamelan Grain. So the Gamelan Grain is some song from the band. I don't know what is band, but the band is known as One More Grain from UK. And they asked me, can you make arrangement or make some instruments for gamelan? And when I hear that music is very gamelan, and I just try how but they use electric guitar, they use drum, they use Western music totally, and some wood instrument. But their music is very connected, strong connected with the gamelan word. So that's why I'm doing this project. So that's why I can see what is the gamelan is not should be physically, but the ideas. That's why I said the music is world heritage. That's mean the ideas we can develop to our culture, something like that. Sorry, too much. Thank you.
No, that was amazing. That was amazing. So any other thoughts about this, about if or your own experience with gamelan as spirit versus gamelan as instrument?
Sorry, I mute the microphone. Yeah, what I do know, like I more interesting to always combine. Sometimes I just create for Western instrument, but the music is come from gamelan or opposite. Sometimes I use gamelan, but there's the ideas is come from anywhere, Western, maybe from Africa or I don't know. But that is I can make some communicate with the the world. This is what the important for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I know what the answer to this is going to be, but you must feel then that it's possible for the Evergreen Club to carry the spirit of gamelan, even though they're not from this place.
They did it. They did it. They did it. So that's why. But sorry, I a bit compare. Like in Holland, in Netherlands. Also, I already collaborate with the ensemble gending called, but they only play contemporary repertoire. They like not like Jody. They don't not necessary. They feel I'm not necessary to learn Japanese gamelan. They use Japanese gamelan. I just percussion player and just play contemporary music. Just it. And it's look for my opinion. They didn't interesting about the what I call the gamelan's ideas, musical gamelan's ideas. They just play and produce. Okay, that's okay. But the Evergreen Club, beside they also develop and invite the another composer to try compose Sundanese gamelan, and the other side, and also they want to learn what's the Sundanese gamelan. This is very amazing because in 2005 there are also some festival in Berlin. There are some interesting project like the Balinese composer should create for example the Padang ensemble, and the Western background should be create Sundanese. They make some cross, and that's very interesting to see how the yeah, this is some like me. For the next month November, I have a new piece for what's bayan, the accordion Russian, also the block flute, pan flute, and viola and percussion, and they asked me to create combine with gamelan. So firstly, I didn't know how to play block flute. What's the technical how to play the bayan, and then I have chance to learn how do they play, and of course I can learn about the culture, and then I got something new. I got some experience how to communicate between my culture with their culture. But now with this piece, this is my culture. Like I invent how to can communicate it with something more origin for me, origin instrument. But I have to learn. So this is my experience. Maybe can help for example about the problem topic we discussed. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe just because that was an incredible number of ideas and thoughts that I think are really incredible that you outlined. Maybe if I could just take it back to the other three panelists, and when we're talking about gamelan as idea or spirit and versus gamelan as instrument, I'm just curious, and please don't think this is corny, but I really think it's important to share. How did this music find each of you? Like what was, is there a moment or is there a recording or a piece in which you became connected to this spirit? maybe Leslie, could I ask you to start? Sorry, Jiro.
Yeah, I could
Jiro,
probably.
go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Very interesting insights, actually, referring to the gamelan as a spirit more than an object as well, because I think that echoes what Benedict Anderson has been saying all along in terms of imagined communities. And for those who don't know what Benedict Anderson is talking about there, an imagined community is like a lateral kind of relationships with a group of people that operates under the spirit of comradeship. And that's actually how Anderson redefined nationalism. So in this sense, it's like instead of viewing nationalism as a very bad thing where it's causing all the oppressions and all that, like Benedict Anderson kind of rotated that a bit, just to emphasize again the good qualities of actually being part of that kind of spirit. And my first encounters with gamelan in the university kind of like it really went on. It kind of underscores like this notion that we have to know the musics of our region, our culture, and I'm invoking the term we because there's also this growing spirit of regionalism back then in Southeast Asia. I think it's also very much geopolitical in nature anyway, but also because we have the ASEAN coming about and like doing all its stuff and all that. So it's like we see our neighboring countries as, like comrades as well. So we're kind of invoking the spirit, and learning their music cultures just made sense for us. And so that's why like it's probably also just like a pretty much like an invention of sorts, but hearing the gamelan or the Javanese gamelan in particular, like when we started doing all these concepts, like if you know your music culture studies and all that, like you kind of see all the connections on how that kind of music related to like what we're also like having in our indigenous communities. And many studies have been published about that. Jose Macedo actually has been very straightforward in having this kind of comparable studies. So yeah, it's really just about like imagining yourself as part of this whole community, and it will also translate then as to like what kind of actions you can take because you're part of the community. So you can just like like stick out in the mud or something as like this is also pretty much very Asian in a way. Like we also want to seek social harmony, and so we don't want to do things that will actually like aggravate or do damage to someone else. And so that's why there's that it's a spirit then, like that's why like learning about the quote with Sabto Rarjo is really very amazing, I would say.
Great, thank you, Jiro. Leslie, can you tell us about how this spirit found you, or how you came into this tradition?
Sure. So I think in many ways my experience was pretty opposite from Jiro's in the sense that I came to gamelan first as gamelan as object. I went to study ethnomusicology at grad school. Ethnomusicologists believe in this thing called bimusicality, which is in order to get inside a music culture, you must play the music. And great, I agree with that. Good job. And my academic advisor when I first arrived we had two ensembles, the gamelan and the Chinese ensemble. My academic advisor at the time was the director of the Chinese ensemble. And so I went to his office at the beginning and he said, okay, these are the classes you have to take here, here, and here. And then he says, okay, you have to play in one of the world music ensembles. Do you play the flute? And I said, no. And he said, do you play the violin? And I said, no. And he said, great, you should join the Balinese gamelan, which was basically him saying, please don't join my Chinese ensemble, you terrible musician. So I joined the gamelan initially. I'd never heard it. I couldn't have pointed out Bali on a map to you. And so I came into it as an academic exercise. I came into it as an object, completely as this is a class I have to take to go to grad school. And initially I really didn't like it very much because when people first start learning gamelan, they don't damp the keys very well. So it all sounded very chaotic to me. And the first moment that I remember the spirit, and it has happened many times since then, especially, going to Bali and playing music there. But the first moment I remember getting a glimpse of it was a few months in, and we were learning this kotekan. And for I assume many people in this room know what that is, but that's an interlocking melody where some people are playing some of the notes and the other people are playing the other notes, and together they fit together like jagged puzzle pieces. And when we learn kotekan in North America, very often we learn the one part and then you plug your ears while the other people learn their part, because you don't want to forget your part. And if you're playing the part that's more offbeat, you really don't want to listen to the person. We learn them as these very separate things, which is really opposite to how it's meant to be heard, which is as this puzzle that fits together. And I was playing my one part and trying very hard not to hear the other part, although I knew we interlocked but didn't know how. And our teacher said, just shut your eyes. And I shut my eyes and I was playing and I was playing, and suddenly I felt like I was playing the whole melody. And it was just this moment where I went, oh, it's bigger than me. And I felt like I was the whole ensemble in this moment. It was this incredible moment. And it lasted, half a minute, and then it went away and it didn't come back again for a while. But at that moment I was hooked. I was just like, okay, well, obviously I'm going to play this my whole life. And I've had many more of those kinds of moments since then. And as I said, especially going to Bali and playing it in that community of people who love gamelan as much as and more than I do, sort of drove that spirit home really strongly. And playing in the temple and playing with people who were much, much, much better than I, but gracious and generous with their expertise, all added to that. But that was my first moment of the spirit.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Curtis, you want to tell us how this music found you as well?
I'm probably the least gamelan person here. I wouldn't consider myself in as part of this music much at all. But I have some small experience with it. I had no idea what gamelan was ever. I never heard about it. I think maybe I might have read about it once in some course at undergrad. I can't recall though, but that's kind of irrelevant because I didn't experience it. I was just looking at a picture of an instrument or something like that. But it was in 1996. And Andrew Timar can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 1996 at the Sound Symposium in St. John's. I believe the Evergreen Club was there. If it wasn't 96, it was 98. Anyways, that's the first time I'd heard gamelan live, or a type of gamelan. And, it was mind-blowing on many levels. Just the sonic experience, like the sounds of the instruments, let alone the music that was being played. But it never grabbed me. It wasn't something I wanted to seek out. That was never a urge. Although whenever I could hear it live, because I moved to Toronto shortly after that experience, I would try and hear it as much as I could if through the Evergreen Club, mostly in Toronto. I think it was 1999 when Andrew mentioned earlier. He had started teaching Javanese gamelan at York University. I was an undergrad student there, so I joined that ensemble, and that opened my eyes a lot to the aesthetics and the group feeling that's necessary to perform that music. It was very, very enlightening to me. But again, it's not something I followed fully afterwards. So I don't know if I can say I caught the gamelan spirit like some of you have. But it's something that amazed me for sure. But yes, I'm not much. I never consider myself a gamelan aficionado. I could be an aficionado, I suppose, but I'm not into it like most everyone else here that's watching. Yeah, but I appreciate it and love the sounds. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Chris. We've got about 15 minutes left. I wanted to make sure that while the four of you are holding space together, if there was any questions you had of each other, since we so rarely get groups of people like this together from across the planet. So any questions from your fellow panelists? Joe, you're a curious fellow, but you have a question for somebody.
May I ask a question if there aren't any?
Sure.
Please, other people too, whoever's there.
I'll turn this on.
Hey,
briefly.
Putu.
Hey. nice for panel two. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. It's great to hear everyone speak and your insight on all of these things that are very complicated and things like that. I do want to touch on the sort of last point you all were talking about with this sort of gamelan as object versus gamelan as spirit. And I talk quite frequently with Arya, who's also here, about these kinds of ideas, but that we sometimes we tend to talk about these things as the object of gamelan and spirit of gamelan not being of verses, not being of this binary opposition, but actually existing simultaneously, right? Because I think you're all correct in saying that, like, the spirit of gamelan can manifest in different kinds of art forms and different kinds of musical practices and social communities, and especially instrumentation. But there is something ostensibly objective about a gamelan, right? Like, you're not going to look at a kulintang ensemble or a Brazilian bateria and say, and even if you hear kotekan or hear balungan or poko or something like that, it's probably not the case that you're going to go, oh, that's gamelan, right? So there is something there that also pertains to the distinction between subjective art and objective art, and that tends to be subjectivity, right? Tends to be a thing we all talk about with art. Oh, music is, because we can't grasp onto it. It's entirely intersubjective and it's entirely up for interpretation, when I don't actually think that's true. And this is where my question is for you all, and that is, when we're talking about, and again, if we're even concerned with authenticity anymore, it seems like we are, but we aren't. But when we're talking about those kinds of things, do you feel like there's a direction where, in order to be more closely to something such as authentic, art has to kind of be objective in this kind of way? Like, there has to be this sort of social and communal understanding that, oh, this piece is supposed to induce trance, or this piece is supposed to be for cremation ceremonies or something like that, right? When the musical material itself can vary, right? But the interpretation is actually pretty dictated by those communities, right? Like, pretty dictated specifically. So anyway, I also realized that wasn't really a question, but
that's okay. You can maybe, if there is a kind of thing you want to elicit from the crew, maybe you could rephrase something that they could respond to.
Sure. Do you think that there are possibilities in the musical practices you participate in to have kind of that objective interpretation of a musical idiom?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I learned gamelan, I learn pieces that have names. I learn about instruments that have names. Those instruments have functions that are different from the other instruments' functions in a bunch of music. Those things are all very objective, right? And also, traditions are malleable. So I think those two things can coexist, right? And I think the problem with the concept of authenticity is that we forget the second part of that. So I think if we can talk about tradition, and I'm much more comfortable with that term than I am with authenticity, in fact, because it allows for a malleability that I feel like authenticity doesn't. 100%. A gamelan is like, there is an object. Well, there are many different kinds of objects which are called gamelan, right? There is an object called a pamade. That's a thing. It has this many notes in it. You play it in these ways. Here's the playing technique. There are tons of objective things about it. Kotekan, like, I explained what kotekan was, and everybody in the room nodded, because there's an objective truth about how that works. And also, there are a million ways to do it, right? So I think it's a yes and. I think there are lots of things that are subjective about any music tradition, any music practice. I think that's what is beautiful about them. That's what is human about them, that we are constantly shifting and constantly changing and constantly finding new ways to do things that excite or move. And also, of course, there are objective things. But then, as you say, you know, context is so much a part of it. So like you can say this music is for trance, and you know, if Desa Kalapatra, right, the place, time, circumstance. If I've been playing a different kind of music for trance, and everybody in that village now associates that music with trance, it's not objective that the music itself trances you. It's objective. It's sub-objective, subjective. It's both of those things. Yeah, I think it's a both and. I think it's all of, thank you for the question and all the stuff around the question. It's a lot to think about.
Great, thank you for that. Any responses further to that question?
I should probably say something then, because this actually reminds me of a previous talk by Filipino composer Jonas Baez. I actually attended his talk sometime, probably a week ago or two, I think, and he was talking about his first encounter with Dieter Mach's premiere of Kammermusik 2. And as many people would know, Dieter Mach has been engaging in many gamelan communities and has also produced works that kind of like echoed that kind of relationship with Indonesia and with these communities. And so like when Jonas first heard Kammermusik 2 in Germany, and this was during the 1990s, and yeah, I don't exactly remember what year, the very first sound kind of reminded him of the gong ageng. Yeah, so that's what he told us in his talk, and that suddenly brought him memories of home. And it's like, for the outsider, it's like, what business does a Filipino have in associating the gong ageng with home? But then again, like it kind of makes sense as well, because because we actually see each other, you know, we see each other as brothers and sisters, and the sound worlds also kind of like blur out, I would even say, even to the point that there are no boundaries sometimes, especially when you're dealing with cultures in Indonesia and also in the southern Philippines. Like there are lots of these conflations and all that. So probably in terms of objective truths, there are lots of subjectivities that also points to objective truths as well. And it's really probably about identifying the objective truths, but more so, you will only know that once you actually like repeat all these subjectivities. And that's why I think blurring boundaries kind of makes sense in a way, in that, you know, we have to explore that avenue first of blurring everything out. I even also remember Jonas talking in an ACL conference, the Asian Composers League conference in 2015. This was in Manila. And he actually commented, still relating to Benedict Anderson, that, you know what, we could always imagine the whole world as one big Asia. Or now to add on to that, now that I thought about it, we could also do it in an opposite way. Then we could also think about different kinds of Asias in the whole world, right? So I think it has something to do more with exercising subjectivity first, before actually coming up with new objective truths that come out of them. And so, yeah, it's a little more abstract at this point, yeah. But that's what's going on in my mind when we're talking about new directions and how to actually like pursue directions in terms of music making, even blurring the tradition between, or even blurring the notions of traditional music and contemporary music, because everything is actually being done in the same gamelan instrumentation, right? We have traditional music and you also have contemporary music. So why do we still classify gamelan as traditional in the first place, right? Because like contemporaneity is also like unfolding within these objects, with these instruments. So yeah, I think that's what I will have to say about the matter.
Great, thank you. We've only got about 5 minutes left, but I'm going to bring Joe back because he has a few audience questions that he wanted to get before we close out.
I think, yeah, here. I think Jody, hold on to your question. We might have time for it, but so I have one comment here from Oscar Smith saying that copyright laws, providing context, that copyright laws are sort of unhelpful, especially in Balinese music where exact melodic borrowing is normal, and saying that adopting copyright is sort of a form of epistemological violence in this context, which I think is a fair point to bring up. We also have a question from Christopher Hull. Does authenticity have greater purchase on instruments and their performance practice than on performances of culture? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Can you repeat it again?
Does authenticity have greater purchase on instruments and their performance practice than on performances of culture?
That's basically asking if, I'm not sure if I understand it fully, although it's very clear, like the presentation or inclusion of a given instrument would be presenting something as authentic. Is that what it's sort of asking? Rather than the inclusion of a non-visual marker of authenticity within the musical practice? I think that was,
Yeah, I think Chris says it was sort of answered by the Gamelan as object versus spirit question. So perhaps we can go to. Jody asks, can you play the guitar without referencing Spain?
Or the Arab world, for that matter.
So, or the violin, without referencing Stradivarius. I mean, I could talk for another hour on this. I think about this all the time. In answer to Chris's question, there was an article in Bolungen many years ago by Jared Powell of Gamelan Pacifica in Seattle called Notation or Not. And in it, he asked that question: will the gamelan ever be free of its cultural identity the way the guitar has become free of Spain, the way I'm not sure I have a wish for that either way. What I wanted to say was, in 1976, I became Lou Harrison's gamelan teacher when he was invited to compose for gamelan by my Javanese teacher, who I'd been dedicated to. After Leslie, I had that exact experience. Something happened, and this little voice said, I'm going to play this music the rest of my life. It was so interesting to hear you say that. So the way that Lou Harrison approached being inspired by music was to build the instruments, to understand them, to take lessons with the best teachers that he could find, to internalize everything that he could learn about the music, so that then when he went to compose, that was part of who he was. He wasn't borrowing it. He became it first. And then it was who he was. And the thing that I learned from Lou, I never studied composition with him, but what I learned from him was that human beings, that all of us, that we are creative creatures. That's our nature, to be creative with whatever we encounter. And maybe that's something to celebrate. If we love a music and we know it and someone wants to be creative with it, let's tell them as much about it as we can. I mean, that's why I started the journal Bolungen, was so artists and scholars would talk to each other instead of people saying, oh, Lou shouldn't compose for gamelan because he hasn't lived in Java for 20 years. Well, what do you think he should know? Let's find a way to share that information, to share that experience. So, and I'm working on something called Distant Roots and Local Flowers, but that works both ways, and I'm not going to get into that. I just want to end with saying that we are all human beings. Whatever cultural activities we engage in, however we formulate our identity, we have something in common that I think transcends all of that. And I think the urge for creativity, the inspiration that the world inspires us to create together out of whatever and whoever we are, is an amazing thing.
Great, thank you for that, Jody. Folks, I, believe it or not, have to jump to another call at this late hour. But Joseph's going to close you out. But I just wanted to say to the panelists, hey, it was really great to hear you speak and to get you know a little bit. Hopefully, I'll be able to follow up with you guys individually because I'm so curious about what you do. But I'm going to sign off and I'll let Joseph do a proper closeout. So thanks, everybody.